So the Stamp Act, I mean, it's really an obnoxious tax. It's obnoxious for lots of different reasons. One, a very basic and very important one. We don't have representatives in Parliament. There's no practical way that we could have representatives, at least as we understand representation in Parliament. It's just too far away. It takes too long to travel to get information back and forth. It just couldn't work. We have our own representatives in our own houses of assembly, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. We recognize that it's one thing for the Burgesses to tax us, and they can make contributions voluntarily to Britain. But for Britain to tax us, for Parliament to tax us, well, we have no representation. I mean, I know we live in morally relativistic times, but what do you call it when someone reaches into your pocket and takes your money without asking? It's stealing, right? I mean, so here's the British government, which is supposed to exist to protect us from thieves like Rob, the barbarian, now acting like a thief, like Rob the Barbarian. And you actually were acting very much like Parliament because you were so considerate and genteel in your thuggery that, you know, I mean, it was really benign, yeah. So we object on that basis. And then all the practical implications of the Stamp Act. How obnoxious. There really was this stamp that was affixed to paper products of various sorts. And when you saw it, you knew, I'm paying extra for this thing because of this stamp. So it was a real reminder that the British government was interfering in people's affairs. And, you know, when you're reading How to Lose an Empire for Dummies, an important point is to try to alienate important constituencies. So let's think. Some important constituencies that the Stamp Act can alienate. Well, there are merchants. There are a lot of paper products that had to bear the stamp, that made them cost more, that meant that people could afford to buy fewer of them, that meant that merchants made less money. And they had to deal with the hassle of administering this, you know, stamp tax and reporting it and collecting it. And then there are lawyers. Lawyers are always overrepresented in houses of assembly, right? They were back then. They probably are now. Lawyers, all contracts, all legal documents had to bear the stamp. The lawyers hated this. And then, of course, as you read through How to Lose an Empire for Dummies, a very important point is alienating the press. So the stamp, it had to go on newspapers, infuriating journalists and printers. And then we learned how important preachers had become as a result of the Great Awakening. As a result of the Stamp Act, the stamp even went on to new Bibles that were sold. And then, of course, there are college professors. College professors rarely actually are important, but they love to think that they are. So as good members of Parliament, we don't want to be rude. We want to make them feel included as well. Even college diplomas had to bear the stamp. So you've alienated all these key constituencies, and yet there's one left. The British, to ensure that there were drunken mobs protesting the Stamp Act, also mandated that the stamp had to be affixed to packages of dice and playing cards. So the drunken rabble from the taverns were infuriated as well. And people protested, they petitioned, they complained, they burned in effigy stamp tax collectors, they intimidated actual stamp tax collectors. The British hardly collected anything at all as far as revenue. And the British government, I see all this bad behavior in America, and again, they're reading there How to Lose an Empire for Dummies. What do you do if you have a child who's misbehaving? A couple of years ago, for example, our daughter, her name's Grace, she's 5 now, but a couple of years ago, she was getting ready for nursery school, and she was it was difficult to get her potty trained. So if Grace used the potty and everything went well, what should we do in response? Give her a lollipop or make her stand in the corner? Give her a lollipop, right? What if Grace very obstinately made a mess in the living room? What would we do? Lollipop or make her stand in the corner? Make her stand in the corner. So what had we done as far as the British were concerned in our resistance and protest and petitioning against the Stamp Act? We'd made a big mess on the imperial carpet. What does the British government do? Remember, they're reading How to Lose an Empire for Dummies. They give us a lollipop. They repeal the Stamp Act. right? They're conditioning our behavior. They repeal the Stamp Act. Now, the following year, they're going to pass the 1767 Townsend duties, a similar series of taxes on lead, glass, paint, paper, and tea. Same objections are raised. It's taxation without representation. This is even worse because they're going to take some of the money from that, some of the revenue from that, and they're going to pay royal governors and other imperial officials in the colonies with that revenue. We used to pay them directly. Our houses of assembly would pay the salaries of governors, and that gave our houses of assembly a significant degree of leverage over these crown-appointed officials. But now that leverage was going to be lost. And we do the same thing. We protest the Townsend duties. We boycott. We petition. And what do the British do? Upon seeing all of this, what they should consider bad behavior on our part, lollipop, we're standing in the corner. What's their response? They give us a lollipop. They do. They pass a resolution ending the Townsend duties. And the day that this takes place, March 5th, 1770, they hope in Parliament will always live on as this banner day in, good Anglo-American relations. Unfortunately for them, unfortunately perhaps for us, certainly unfortunately for people in Boston, that day would be marked by a different event. There were a number of troops that had been stationed in Boston. By our modern day terminology, we'd call them peacekeeping forces. You got to feel sorry for these guys. They're very poorly paid. Many of them work odd jobs. They moonlight in addition to being British soldiers. That causes the people of Massachusetts to really resent them because the market for labor, the demand for labor, hadn't changed since their arrival, but the supply of labor had skyrocketed since their arrival because they all work, odd jobs as laborers. So the wages had gone down a lot. So the people of Boston, the working men of Boston, hate these British soldiers. One night, Saturday night, March 3rd, 1770, a bunch of British soldiers are off duty. They're walking around town. It's Saturday night. You can imagine the sort of activities that people had been engaging in. Then a crowd of locals sees these British soldiers, and one local yells out to the soldiers, "Hey, any of you guys need a job?" And one of the soldiers, he turns around, and he's like, yeah, I need work. And then one of the Bostonians said, I'll clean this up slightly because we're going to lunch. "Clean my outhouse." And the result, this is a big insult, the result was this big street fight, this big brawl. So tensions could not have been higher. The next day, Sunday, March 4th, people go to church. Day after that, Monday, March 5th, 1770, one of these British soldiers is standing in front of the customs house, this horribly hated building, this big target. He's standing guard. And there are all these people who start to gather around, beginning especially with young kids throwing snowballs. First, it's probably just for fun, but then they start throwing sticks and stones and no doubt words, which perhaps did hurt him and his feelings, because he called in reinforcements. And so now, there are a number of British soldiers standing guard in front of this building. And then, we don't know how this took place. We don't know why this took place. It seems like an orchestrated move, but all of the church bells in Boston started to ring. Now, this is a Monday night. There's no reason, no normal reason why all the church bells in Boston should start ringing. What was it a sign of when all the church bells started to ring in the middle of the night? Some sort of public emergency, maybe? Like what could be worth sounding an alarm for? Yeah, like a fire or something like that. So people came out of their houses. Some of them had buckets. They assumed there's a fire. And the crowd kind of all coalesces around the customs house in Boston. And this big revolutionary mosh pit is what it's become. And the soldiers are there with their backs against the wall and their bayonets fixed at the end of their muskets. And people in the front of this crowd have their chests poking into these bayonets. They don't want to get these bayonets poked into their chest. They push back. And the people in the back of the crowd, they feel the crowd surging back. They push forward. And it's chaos and it's pandemonium and people are shouting and the bells are ringing and it's dark and people are throwing things. And what could the bells be a sign of? Fire, someone says. And one of the British soldiers does. And then the other British soldiers fire. And then you have 11 bloody bodies on the ground. Now that's the Boston Massacre. That's as best as we can reconstruct it, what really happened in the Boston Massacre. That's not a massacre, that's like the Boston misunderstanding, you know? But as far as Americans are concerned, this is the Boston Massacre. You know, Silversmith, son of Liberty, Paul Revere, does this engraving. And it's very clear who he portrays as being at fault. Right? It's Captain Preston raising his sword, giving the command, fire. And it's clear who has their backs against the wall. It's not the British soldiers, it's the citizens of Boston. Even a dog is caught in the crossfire. So the British government, it's not just taking away people's property. It's not just taking away people's liberty. It's now taking away people's lives. A couple years later, people will go to Griffin's Wharf. They'll board the Eleanor and the Dartmouth and the Beaver, 3 ships that are loaded up with taxed British tea. People had been boycotting British tea. They'd been drinking alternatives. But now the British, they were wily and cunning. They decided, they knew that we were good. Like, at heart, we were British, and we loved our tea. Loved it. We were drinking this weak herbal stuff and this, you know, black market Dutch stuff. We wanted the real stuff, and they had it. And they taxed it. And we had said, no, we will not buy the tea because we will not pay the tax. But they came up with a way to make it almost irresistible. They subsidized that tea so much that even though it was still taxed, it was like even cheaper than the lousy herbal stuff that we had been drinking as an alternative. Our hands were shaking. We were trembling, you know, with temptation. We wanted this tea so badly. So before anyone gave into that temptation, the Sons of Liberty boarded these ships, busted open their cargo holds, and dumped into Boston Harbor 90,000 pounds of tea. And they're very scrupulous about this. There's one man, old man, was stuffing tea into his pockets, and he was discovered, and he was sent home naked in disgrace. The point wasn't to steal the tea. The point was to destroy the tea. They had to smash open some padlocks to get into the cargo holds of these vessels. The next day, the 3 masters of these vessels were presented with new padlocks, right? We were only destroying the property that we needed to destroy. And, you know, we were bound by these rules, an important thing to consider. Well, you'd think that the British government would be bound by rules too, or at least by precedent and tradition. They seem to like those things. Except this time, again, we'd kind of made a mess on the imperial carpet. What do the British do? Do they give us a lollipop, or do they give us the sanction of standing in the corner? Before, they'd been just giving us lollipops. What do they give us now? A Walmart beating. Did you ever go to Walmart and see parents wailing on their kids? Right? We go. I don't know what it is about Walmart that brings out like the frustration in parents. I felt it myself. Try not to give into the temptation. The British just lose control. They impose upon us what they call the coercive acts. We call them the intolerable acts. They shut down Boston Harbor. They outlaw the meeting of the Massachusetts Assembly. They outlaw town meetings. I mean, we can't even govern ourselves. And we're Englishmen. I mean, governing yourself, that's what Englishmen do. Some people begin to say that the British are treating us like what? Close. Some people say they're treating us like Irishmen. They're treating us like an invaded, conquered people. Others say, no, the British The British are treating us like slaves. By 1774, Americans have convened a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Patrick Henry has proclaimed that we are in a state of nature. The British government has gone from being a real government. The British government is supposed to be protecting our liberties. The British government is now destroying our liberties, a fact that is going to seem increasingly clear after April 1775, when the British government sends its troops through Lexington out to Concord to take Americans' weapons from them, to take away their ability to defend themselves, as free people do. It will take Americans a long time, more than a year after those first shots are fired, to determine what the nature of their rebellion will be. But it has begun. And in Philadelphia, finally, in July of 1776, people will gather together and they will sign on to declare their independence. Their independence from not only the British government, but their independence from tyrannical government, and pledge their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor to a government that will meet its most essential and really only just purpose, that of protecting individual rights.